Okay, what I want to do today is first talk about the exam really quickly, just go over it. Everybody saw your exam scores are released, and so you should be able to take a look at those. And then I want to go on and start talking in earnest about mental illness. We're going to try and cover the two sort of big ones today, give you a quick overview of schizophrenia and depression. Which I again refer to as the two big mental disorders. Just give you an overview of all of them, the different kinds, and give you a flavor for what these disorders are like. Show you some examples of people experiencing them. They're both very debilitating. The exam. So there's not a whole lot to say about it. It went. The scores and everything looked great in the sense of, nice, basically, as you guys know now, a normal distribution, more or less, kind of skewed to the upper end, which is what we like. The mean was 47. The rest of the statistics there, again, the range was, the lowest score was 20, and then the highest score was 63. So nobody got all of them right, but somebody got almost all of them right. As you know, and again, this is always the hardest thing to explain. I say it every time. So we don't really curve the exams, right? We curve at the end where all the scores are in and everything else. So that your score on any exam goes in as a raw score. But everybody wants to know, so you didn't really get a grade on the exam, right? But if you were to get a grade on the exam so that you know where you are in this class, right, then this is the kind of cutoffs I would use to honor that 15% A's, 25% B's, 45% C's, 10% D's, 5% F's, right? And again, it's skewed slightly, toward the top a little bit, but as you can see, if you got a 56 or over, you're kind of solidly in A territory. If you got 55 to 50, B territory, 49 to 38 is C territory, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So you should be getting a sense now, right, of where you are in this class and how you're doing on these exams. So if you're not happy, kick in, right? Go see your exam, take a look at it. You can do that with any of the TAs, right, at any of their office hours. Again, I prefer not to do that, but if you go to them, look at your exam, come see me. I'm happy to go over it, give you strategies, talk about how to do better in the class. Just very simply, right? Start coming to class. If you're not happy, start reading the book, start going to discussion sections, right? Those will really help you. And then again, I have some tips about those. Do the extra credit, all the extra credit you can. If you're not happy with your grade, don't leave anything on the table. Don't leave points on the table, right? So do the extra credit, and those are the best things that you can do. Any questions about the exam? Good. So that's that. So get out your clickers. I just want to ask you a quick question. Before we even know anything about it, much, people you may have some sense of schizophrenia. Maybe you did some of the reading. Maybe you had it in other classes. Just tell me whether you think schizophrenia is likely to be genetic, environmental, or a combination of both. What do you think causes schizophrenia? Do you think it's a genetic condition? Do you think it's environmental forces, so something that is because of experiences you've had, maybe traumatic experiences you've had, or a combination of both, A, B, or C? Okay. Confirms kind of low attendance here. Okay. So you guys learn well, right? It's a combination of both. And this is going to be a theme, and you're going to hear it again and again today. And you heard it last time, this idea of this kind of combined biopsychosocial model, the idea that virtually every mental illness is really a combination of environmental factors and biological factors, genetic factors, right? And this notion of diathesis-Stress that I'll talk about again during the lecture, and that's again really important. And so then disorders differ a little bit about how much of these components may be involved, right? But there's most of the research seems to suggest that it's this combination that's so crucial, and that's really crucial again to understanding the nature of mental illness and where it comes from. So let me tell you a little story. I did my graduate work at Princeton in mid-1980s, early to mid-1980s. When I was there, anybody ever been around Princeton? One street, it runs along the university called Nassau Street. There was this guy who was always walking around that we saw all the way through. I saw all the way through graduate school. He tended to wear kind of a checkered shirt like this guy, very often a striped coat, and he would be on the street, look like a homeless guy's hair. I can't mess up my hair. So as you see how my hair's all messed up now, you can see. It's method acting, sorry. So he would walk around and he would be talking to himself. He had these kind of weird mannerisms, and he would do this, and we were always going, oh wow, this guy's, he was around all the time, walking on the streets in the middle of the day, middle of the night, and we didn't quite know who he was, right? And so I left Princeton and went on to do my thing. I left in 1986. And then, I think it was 8 years later, I got my Princeton Alumni Weekly, and I was really shocked that when I looked on the cover of it, there was the same guy. And in fact, he just won a Nobel Prize. Does anybody know who this is?
John Nash.
John Nash, right? So John Nash, who was the subject of the film The Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, right, tells the story of this guy. Now, I had no idea. I was shocked. I thought he was a homeless guy. All of us did. I have no idea who he was until all these years later, and he appeared. You can imagine, you kind of get the magazine. Actually, I couldn't find it. I looked for a long time on the internet to see if I could find it because his face was on the cover, right? You just kind of went, wow, right? But it tells you a lot about what schizophrenia. How many people have seen the movie The Beautiful Mind or heard of it, right? It tells the story of this young, brilliant, socially awkward kid, physicist not a physicist, a mathematician at Princeton, who ends up, he's problematic, ends up developing really the basis of game theory, and then has a schizophrenic break, and really hits him in the middle of graduate school, and he has all sorts of problems. And he eventually comes back. And again, he had a terrible period. I knew him during his bad period when he was living in Princeton but was not able to work, was just wandering the streets. But later on, with the help of medication, he's come back, and he lectures at Princeton. Today, he's getting old. I don't know, actually. I think he still does. But has been able to suppress his symptoms, even though they were really terrible. And again, it tells you a lot about what schizophrenia is like. As an example, we'll kind of go through it now. There's Russell Crowe is getting his Nobel Prize as John Nash. So schizophrenia is often referred to as the cancer of mental illness. It's because of its severity, right? It's this incredibly debilitating disorder. It disrupts your thoughts to the point that it's difficult to maintain relationships. It's difficult to maintain, a functional life. Again, the schizophrenia is about 1% of the population, takes about 50% of hospital beds. It's one of the few mental illnesses that really sometimes requires a lot of institutionalized treatment. It tends to, very much like in the case of John Nash, it tends to kick in at late adolescence, late teens, or early 20s. So people, very often, you know, they seem to carry on a very, you know, normal life, a relatively normal life, you know, no trouble signs. And then all of a sudden in late adolescence it strikes and becomes very debilitating. Interestingly though, although people can't see it while it's going on, they very often, it's recognizable later. This is a really wonderful research by, I think her name is Elaine Walker, really well-known clinical psychologist, who went back and found people who were schizophrenic, not schizophrenic, and then wanted to see whether there were any signs. It comes in later on, you know, at late adolescence. Are there any signs early that people are missing? And so she wanted to find some way to compare them, and she decided to look at birthday party videos. So a lot of people have birthday party videos. So she went and looked at got people's home movies of birthday parties from some that were kids that later on became schizophrenic and some that didn't. And when you coded those, you could tell. Even though it wasn't obvious, there were signs, there were differences in the behavior of those children at an early age. They tended to show more negative faces, less positive faces, sort of odd motor patterns, things that actually become characteristic of schizophrenia later on. So nobody knew, it wasn't enough that you could tell your kid was going to be schizophrenic, but after the fact you could go and see that something was there, that the basis of it was there, even though it didn't really strike and become debilitating until later. The prognosis is you know, getting better but pretty bad. About 25% of the people recover. 50% of the people can become functional, again with medication, functional with symptoms. 15% require long-term hospitalization. About 10% commit suicide. 50 to 60% can't work, don't marry, can't, you know, they live in poverty. Many of the people that you see on the street are probably schizophrenic, right? We tend not to institutionalize people anymore, and those people, but their symptoms are debilitating enough that they can't function in real life. Right? Really interesting examples. Here's another, I want to show you a little clip of this, another very famous example. Anybody ever seen the movie The Soloist? With, God, I can't remember his name. Who's the guy that's in it? Jamie Foxx is terrific in this movie. A real life story about a journalist for the LA Times named Steve Lopez, who found this schizophrenic man, Nathaniel Ayers. And let me just show you a little 5-minute clip from a 60 Minutes thing because it gives a really good example of his behavior as well and tells the story. So let me just.
Now, one of those urban fables that happens to be true. Steve Lopez is a newspaper columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Nathaniel Ayers is a troubled man with a brilliant past. They met by chance on the streets of downtown LA, an encounter that would change them both. The story of their friendship is a tale about madness, redemption, and the mysterious power of music. At the insistence of Mr. Ayers, who was taught good manners as a child, they call each other Mr. We will do the same. Mr. Ayers, Mr. Lopez, introduced in a way by Mr. Music himself, Mr. Ludwig van Beethoven.
I was in downtown Los Angeles, and I heard beautiful music.
That day 3 years ago, Mr. Lopez, a deadline approaching, was pounding the pavement, stumped for something to write about. A few blocks from the office by a small park, where a statue of Beethoven had been erected, he found Mr. Ayers, a homeless man, playing not as a panhandler, but for himself. Music to chase away the demons that forever stalk him. What piqued your curiosity in the first place about this homeless guy?
Desperation, sweating out another column, looked like it could work. I thought, okay, where did this all begin? How does this guy end up on this street corner?
Shalom.
58, was once a hugely gifted young musician accepted by Juilliard, the country's preeminent music school, whose talent and future were crushed by the weight of a devastating, incurable mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia. His passion for music is perfectly clear. His illness becomes obvious as he tries to describe Beethoven.
And there he is, still there, the consternation. And he's complete with another symphony, the elucidation, you know, and my mind goes wild, you know. And the bird droppings are wiped away by the workers, and he's just as real and green as the next tree, or beautiful scene.
After their first meeting, Mr. Lopez tracked Mr. Ayers to the place he called home, a downtown tunnel where he played by day and slept at night, carrying sticks to ward off the rat. Though he was trained to play the bass, he also taught himself trumpet, cello, and violin. Playing the music in that tunnel with the cars, and exhaust, and God knows what. Why there?
That seemed orchestral. The commotion, the calamity, and the sounds.
You were part of the symphony of the big city.
Well, schizophrenically, yes.
You got a couple of tunes out there?
Slowly, Mr. Ayers.
I'll just stop it there. I just wanted to show you a little bit of it. Again, it's really, again, well-known story. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. It's not that every schizophrenic is a brilliant person, right? These are just the poignant stories, the ones of John Nash and Nathaniel Ayers, right? But it highlights how this can strike anybody and how debilitating it is. Take people who have all this incredible talent and just sort of reduce them to people who can't function anymore because of this disordered kind of thinking. So let's talk about some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. Again, they have what are called positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So the positive symptoms are often referred to as psychosis or psychotic symptoms. Delusions, right? Delusions of reference, delusions of grandiosity. So delusions are just beliefs that aren't true, things that they think that things are referencing them. Oh, that billboard's about me, or those people are talking about me, or I'm. Delusions of grandiosity are often part of it. That everything sort of revolves around them. Maybe that they're some religious figure or leader, or generally more important than they really are. And there's also, these are delusions of, these are sort of disordered thinking, and there's really disorders of perception, so hallucinations, this tendency to see things or hear things. Everybody okay back there? Right, so in The Beautiful Mind, for example, in the movie, they depicted it by having actual characters talking to this guy, so you don't, some spoiler alerts, like some of the people in that movie aren't real, right? They're hallucinations that somebody's having, right? So it actually lends itself nicely to a movie where you can depict these things, right? 'Cause it's hard to imagine, what this is like. But this, again, these disorders of thinking and perception, believing things that aren't true, seeing things and hearing things that aren't there. There's also negative symptoms. Very often there's disorders of emotion or affect, right? Where people are either showing, so it's not just the sort of disordered thinking, but it's disordered affect or emotional system, where they're either sort of not having the emotion that you would imagine, laughing at odd times or getting upset at odd things. Either that or, again, some kinds of schizophrenia, we'll talk about the different kinds, but tend to have flat affect, where the person seems to have little or no emotion at all, even in situations that should call for that. There's also some of what you saw in Nathaniel Ayers' disorganized speech or behavior, loose associations, inappropriate affect, catatonia, another one. Again, we'll talk about the different subtypes, but catatonia is sort of a lack of movement. So very often there's, again, disorders of movement as well, and sometimes just like there's a lack of affect, there's a lack of movement. And social withdrawal, right? So they tend not to be around people. One of the ways you can pick it up, a lot, again, is this sort of disorganized speech sort of idea. And you see some good examples of this. Are just some examples of these kinds of disorganized speech that schizophrenics show that are kind of, the people pay a lot of attention to because they you try to get a sense of what's going on in the person's mind. So you get things like derailment. So they'll start talking about one thing, and then it'll sort of, they often talk about this idea of clang associations, that something will just knock them and they'll start talking about one thing and then they'll talk about another. Oh yeah, I grew up in Iowa. Yeah, Iowa's got corn. I love corn. Do you like cornflakes? Right? So there's a connection, but they kind of get off track. Tangentiality, going off in a semi-relevant direction, sort of the same kind of thing. Clanging, so that, what did he say? The consternation and the reputation, and they start, it's the words, the sounds of the words that seem to get them off. So it's a lack of, again, it's disorganization is the key idea, right? So things sort of go off. Nyllogisms, they create new words sometimes. Actually, it's kind of clever. One I've seen in textbooks, the idea that one example, somebody that referred to being really asleep as they were bed dead, right? Or they'll create things like foot mittens, right, for socks, and they'll just put words together, and they make sense. You can see that there's something there, right? There's some rationality to it, but it's loose and. Sometimes again you get this kind of word salad where it gets incoherent, where words just seem to go together. Likely because of these other things. You're clanging, you're doing, kind of loosely jumping from one thing to another that may make sense inside of your head, and it's hard to know from the outside. Or repeating back other speech. Echolale is another one where you'll say, "How are you? How are you? I'm fine. I'm fine." Right, well, they'll just talk back to you like that. And they can very often articulate themselves fairly well, but obviously they're not responding, acting in a responsive fashion. But let me show you, because these are just, it's the best way to show these things is with examples. So let me show you, let me show you another example. This is somebody who doesn't go on to be famous and rich and famous, but it shows a lot of really interesting symptoms. So let me just play this. Again, another clip of a schizophrenic person, and you'll see some examples of these kinds of loose associations and things, disorganized speech. Her name is Heather.
What do you drink? What do you eat? Do you realize that I have a monopoly over the coffee industry? Okay, so that's the problem, isn't it? That's the complaint, right? Well, I have kryptonite. You know what that is, don't you? Kryptonite? And, so if I had kryptonite and I drink coffee and soda, and no one else knows what to eat, I mean, you don't have rights? Do you have rights? To eat raw eggs. When I was pregnant, I think boys get pregnant and girls don't. But I ain't going this, but, do you eat raw eggs? No, what do you eat and drink? Is that the big problem? Do you know what to keep you sane, Brian? Is that a complaint? No? Okay.
My daughter now is in a state hospital. We, like most families, have run out of funds after years of seeking help from all the private facilities. And there certainly is a vast difference between the private facility and the state hospital. These are not hospitals. These are institutions, some of them very much like prisons. When it comes time to take her back to the hospital, she's, reluctant to go back. And then I say to myself, is it possible that I could keep her home?
Why not shopping?
And then I...
You want to go planet shopping? You want to go?
What kind of shopping?
Shopping.
What is that?
What? I don't know how you do all.
Oh, Heather, is it a soap?
Huh? Is Panax a soap? Panax is a soap, yeah.
Oh, and you want to buy some?
Yeah.
Is it a special kind of soap? Oh, we'll stop on the way. You want to stop and get them?
When I'm calling back.
Heather, we'll have to go back, you know that.
I do nothing. Believe me, I do nothing. Okay?
Nothing weird.
Yeah, I do nothing. I don't care. I do nothing.
Well, Heather, we're going to have to go back. You know that. Well, we don't have to go back right away.
But you're not rough. They wait till they come here with the straight guys, okay?
No, they're not going to do that.
If they don't do that, they don't have to go back. This is the law, Mrs. Bond told me in the morning that I am not welcome back. She said, they said that.
Well, they shouldn't come after you. We're not going to have them.
I do nothing, and that's why I want to do nothing.
I know, Heather, but we do have to go back so that you can come here again and stay longer and stay overnight. You know that, Heather. We're going to have to leave, and then you'll come home again, Heather.
I'm not going to Washington.
Well, just waiting for the paperwork.
Did you ever have a complex? A president of the United States complex? I mean, you're retarded. You know, I'm retarded. You know this, I didn't know. No, that's nothing. I'm retarded. Right? I'm an idiot, a moron.
You're not, Heather. You're none of those things, Heather. You're
I'm
none
a
of those
boss. I'm a boss. I'm an orderer, a dictator, you know?
You're not retarded, Heather.
Could you buy a product on the way? Will you come back to Manhattan today? Where do you live in Manhattan? Central Park. Near the Samaritans? Did you ever wear a dress? Katie Bell was the feminine bottle of mine. This is the gorgeous dresses.
So you see a lot of the examples there. I mean, so a bunch of things, right? Almost impossible to take care of somebody like that at home. They'd like to, loving parents, apparently, right? But she is unpredictable. There, you can also see sort of a core intelligence in her, right? So there's some part of her that has some knowledge that can make some sense, and then she's all over the place. Can't keep track of where she is, has bouts of sort of inappropriate affect where she seems to get mad or accusatory, and then kind of pulls back, laughs at unusual times. That's a really good example of what schizophrenia looks like up close, and it obviously really debilitating and impossible for somebody like that to live. There's in the DSM, there's been a huge, big attempt a vigorous attempt over the years to try to categorize schizophrenia into different types. And it's been kind of a funny battle. You can kind of put people into these types based on what are the predominant symptoms that they're showing, but there isn't really good evidence that these are separate conditions somehow, and that they people will show mixed sets of symptoms, et cetera, but the general categorization that they talk about is that first there's sort of disorganized schizophrenia, which is, in a sense, kind of regular old schizophrenia, the sorts of things you saw. disorganized speech or behavior, flat or inappropriate affect or emotion. That's really kind of the core one. Then there's a version that I missed one up above, paranoid schizophrenia, the one you hear about a lot, where their delusions and hallucinations very often have the quality of thinking that people are out to get them. They cause the patient a lot of anxiety, that there's people out to get me, those like delusions of reference. Oh, you know, that TV show, those people on a TV show, they're watching me. I'm not watching them, they're watching me, right? Or people are out to get me. Sometimes, again, with these delusions of grandeur, oh, the President of the United States wants to kill me, right? So they think they're more important than they are. And all those symptoms sort of organize themselves around a sense of fear or paranoia. There's catatonic schizophrenia, which is, again, this interesting one where it's characterized by immobility or excessive purposeless movement, extreme negativism, or that kind of echolalia, parroting people's speech or movements in ways. So this up in the corner, you see sometimes people with schizophrenia, they, again, very often will have some sort of movement issues, right? But then catatonic schizophrenia will sometimes take a position in some awkward way and just literally stay there. Just freeze in that position, right? And sometimes even difficult to move them around. They'll kind of go back and that seems to be, and you would think, oh yeah, there's a really different sort of kind of symptom between delusional thinking and this immobility. So that seems to be a different kind of thing, but it's hard to figure out how it's different or what the underlying causes that might be different. And then there's the kind of grab bag, undifferentiated residual schizophrenic symptoms without fitting one of the above types, right? So again, they have a lot of trouble. There's this desire to kind of categorize people on these symptoms, but it's more challenging, you think, to make these things real. And it's not clear that whether they're just descriptive labels, just describing the kind of symptoms that people have, or whether there's some sort of difference in the etiology or the cause underlying them. In terms of causes, right, I'm going to paint this familiar tale. So there seems to be genetic disposition involved. So these are the concordance rates over here. Concordance rate, again, is just that correlation between if one person has schizophrenia and what's the probability that somebody else is going to have it. So again, in monozygotic twins and identical twins, it's about 20 to 50% concordance. So if your identical twin is schizophrenic, there's a 25 to 50% chance that you will be schizophrenic as well. Where dizygotic twins, it's much lower, 10 to 15%. Again, they still share genetic relatedness, right? And so over here you can see that in a general population, again, there's about 1%. But first cousins, it doubles even. The probability if one first cousin has schizophrenia, there's a 2% chance another one will. Same with uncles. You can see and again, these are ranked order. As you go down, these are people who become more genetically related. And as you become more genetically related, the higher your probability is of having it, the higher the concordance rate. So again, in identical twins, about 48% in this study. Fraternal twins, 17%, et cetera. Right, so there seems to be some genetic component. And most of the research really points to, in a lot of these disorders, some sort of imbalance and inefficiency in the way that neurotransmitters are present and used in the brain. Right, so you, in other parts of this class, will get, of the 11-9 series, right, you get more into what neurotransmitters are. Again, these are the chemicals in the brain that send signals back and forth. And what the one chemical, the one neurotransmitter that's been implicated in schizophrenia is what's called dopamine. And the idea that it's sort of that the effectiveness of some antipsychotic drugs is linked with how strongly they block dopamine. So the idea is there's an excess of this dopamine in the brain, right, which somehow is what's causing the disruption, the disorganization of thinking. Right, there's too much dopamine floating around in there, and then by blocking it somehow, right, that its use in the brain, that is what reduces the symptoms. And again, that seems to be the case with, and there's lots of antipsychotic drugs, and there's been a lot of this is, some of this is discovered in sort of a backhanded way, right? So that people would use drugs to try to help people with these different conditions, and then they'd later on, before they really understood even what those drugs were doing, completely. And that's what you see in some of these antipsychotic drugs. What they seem to do is block dopamine. But again, the story is much more complex than that. These simple stories almost never pan out with mental disorders, right? So this another neurochemical called glutamine also seems to be involved. And these dopamine blockers, they take effect right away. So if you give somebody these, again, particularly the next generation dopamine blockers, right? I'm going to talk a little bit more about treatment, and again, including medication treatment later in a few days here. But if you give people these dopamine blockers, like they take effect they work right away. They start blocking the dopamine, but they don't have any effect on symptoms for weeks. So even though you bring the level down, it's not like the level of dopamine in the brain is directly related to the symptoms, right? So there's always these lags. And so people, there's a lot of uncertainty exactly about what's going on, how much more complicated it is, although there's good evidence that there's some sort of neurochemical imbalance in the brain, probably genetically determined, right? So you have a genetic vulnerability to have this kind of particular neurochemical imbalance in the brain. There's also some evidence that it's related to brain structural defects. So the brains of schizophrenics look different than the brains of other people. So they have these enlarged ventricles, this little space here in the middle. They tend to have a smaller hippocampus, abnormally sized neurons. Again, and if you're thinking, getting this whole idea that it's just disorganized thought, that somehow the normal thinking processes aren't working, you're kind of bouncing around, that there's something going on here, in the brain that's causing this. Now, the problem again is that none of these defects are specific to schizophrenia or characterize all patients, but there is, so not all schizophrenics have these enlarged brains, but some do. And so what do you do with that? We'll do this first. Go ahead, question.
In September of last year, they held a study that showed that schizophrenia was like 8 different genetically distinct disorders.
Yeah, I don't know. So he said that last year they came out with a paper that says it's 8. Yeah. So look it up. Yeah. Again, this is the problem, right? So you don't know whether it's one thing or a bunch of things. And none of these things are definitive, right? So this is all these studies come in, but this is that struggle that they're going through, right? So if you want to send that to me, that'd be great. We can talk about it. So again, this isn't exactly my field, but I mean, even that, what that really illustrates is this desire to try and tie these things to specific genetic dispositions, right? And there's different kinds of symptoms, so maybe those are related to different kinds of maybe they're a different thing, or maybe they're the same thing to just manifest itself in different ways in people. Let me just show you. Here's just a little 1-minute video about that shows you a little bit more about the brain.
Of identical twins, one normal, the other apparently suffering from schizophrenia.
I don't think you have to know anything about magnetic resonance imaging to recognize that these are not exactly the same brains. And with this scan, there are dark regions, the so-called spinal fluid spaces, are bigger in this patient, in this subject, which is the affected twin, than in this subject at exactly the same spot in the brain, and this is the healthy twin. And
So there's been brain shrinkage then of some sort?
Yeah, I think the assumption would be that there's some process, a pathological process, some disease process, that has affected this brain to produce a reduction in the overall volume of this brain, and that the inside of the head, which has not changed in volume, now has greater spinal fluid spaces to take up for the loss of the volume of brain tissue.
So the real issue here is this a cause or is this an effect? And it looks more like it's an effect. Right, so they're looking for, well, what is it? Maybe it's something about the structure of the brain, right, that's causing people to be schizophrenic. And you find these kinds of patterns, although they're not perfectly correlated. But I think the general accepted consensus, right, is that this is probably more likely an effect of schizophrenia, right, that somehow it causes this shrinkage and excess in the fluid around the brain. So there's some biological component to it. It's all mixed up, right, in neurochemicals, and the structure of the brain, but there's also evidence that it's got environmental components to it, or again, as people are trying to sort this out. One really interesting idea is there's some thought that it may have to do with the prenatal environment. Right, that in fact there's some people believe that there may be some virus that causes it. And what's interesting about that is, again, you get this in monozygotic twins. There are sometimes monozygotic twins share the same placenta, and sometimes they each have their own placenta. Right, so in a sense their blood circulation is shared if they have the same placenta, but not if they have a different one. And the rate, the concordance rate is 60% if they have a single one, and only about 11% if there's a double placenta, suggesting that, well, something infects them, they share it together, right, in the prenatal environment, and that's maybe what causes schizophrenia. Right, you can see that's an environmental cause. It's not a genetic thing. It's something that happened to them, even though it's happening prenatally. There's lots of evidence, again, that it shows up in low socioeconomic people. Right, so this is just the rate of prevalence in Chicago that's very high in the inner city, much lower as you go out. But of course, it's really hard to separate out cause and effect. Does poor nutrition, all the things that go with poverty, the sort of environmental problems that go with poverty, do they contribute to the cause of schizophrenia? Or is there some sense that, well, maybe the parents had some of those traits as well, they're not doing well, that it's really the fact that if that tendency is in your genetic line, then you're very likely to not do well in society, not do well, not make a lot of money, not be able to hold down good jobs. Right, there may be something that even when it's not full-blown schizophrenia, maybe it's doing it. Right, certainly when people become schizophrenic, they tend to lose a lot of money, tend to be downward drift into low socioeconomic status. There's some evidence, and this has been one of the old theories about this, was that it was really, they blamed it on the moms, right? So schizophrenic was having a harsh mother who was, caused you to have this psychotic break. And there's really good evidence that that's not the primary cause. Right, there's some genetic cause, but there is some evidence that expressed parental emotion, be critical, hostile, over-involved, tends to predict the first break, how early the first break in schizophrenia happens, and whether you relapse or not. So it's kind of correlated with, at least with how bad schizophrenia is, right? Whether it happens early and whether it relapses is somehow related to expressed parental emotion. But none of these things, again, are specific to schizophrenia or characterize all patients. Right? So there's this looseness of it. It's hard to say, well, gee, here's specifically what causes it. Here's specific genetic cause, a specific neurochemical, a specific environmental contributor. But all of these things seem to be wrapped up in it. And again, this is really consistent with this idea. I just want to stress this again. I know the slide's a little jarring, but do you guys remember we talked about the two-factor theory of emotion? When we were talking about emotion, and this idea that, Schachter and Sayers, that's just an old slide from there, where you had the idea that emotion had to have some stimulus, you had to have the arousal, and then you had the cognitive label, and to get emotion, you had to have both of those things. This kind of idea of a two-factor theory, right? So this is the idea of the diathesis-stress model that all these things seem to suggest, right, is exactly the same sort of logical structure, right? So the idea behind this diathesis-stress model is that you need both the vulnerability and the stress, the abuse, to produce mental illness. So if you have a biological or psychological event, something that precipitates harsh parenting or some terrible thing that happens to you, if you have the psychological vulnerability, and you have to have both the psychological ability and the event, really, to cause mental illness. Right? It's got to be both of those things. And that's what this stuff suggests, is that if there's a biological vulnerability to schizophrenia. But in and of itself, that's not necessarily going to manifest itself in schizophrenia or lead to serious cases of schizophrenia. But if you also have the environmental problems, if you have the diathesis, the biological in this case vulnerability, right? If then that is compounded by having maybe, again, a disturbed family pattern or particular environmental trauma, poor nutrition, poor environment, something like that, a virus maybe, right, who knows, that it's only when you have both of those that you get the mental illness, right? So that's what all this stuff starts to suggest. There's a biological component to it, there's an environmental component to it. And when you get both of those, that's when things happen. You remember this graph from last time, right? This is what this sort of thing suggests, that if you look at, this was the study where they were looking at the parents had a biological, the mom had a schizoid personality, right? And then whether the children were going to manifest it too. Right, and if the children went in, so the red ones are the index parents where there seems to be a biological genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, and if you get adopted into a healthy family, the red line isn't any higher than the green line, right? You tend to show that manifest that biological vulnerability, but if you have a disturbed family pattern, right, then you do. So it's a combination of having the vulnerability and having the environmental sort of insult, right? And you notice, again, even in the disturbed family, if you're in a control, you don't have that biological disposition, you're not showing schizophrenia either. It's only when you have both, right? That's the idea of diathesis-stress, and that's what seems to be, even though there's a significant genetic component to schizophrenia, there's no question that environmental factors also play a role, right? Any questions about that? Okay. Have you ever been depressed? Lasting for more than a day or two. So this is a common sort of thing. Just tell me really simply, yes or no. Have you ever been depressed for a couple days, just feeling really down, terrible? Or have you never been depressed? A, yes, I've been depressed. No, I haven't. 75% of you say you've been depressed. 25% say you haven't. That's a pretty good estimate. This is a very, very common condition, right? This idea of being depressed. We all kind of know what it is, right? And it's, at least in its kind of normal, typical form. And then the question is, what happens to this as it becomes more debilitating to people and more of a mental illness? Again, it's often referred to as the common cold of mental illness, right? Lots and lots of people, you ask people, again, 75% of you say that, yeah, there's been times when I just felt bad, right? There's a wonderful book, if you ever want to read it, by a guy named William Styron, who wrote Sophie's Choice and a couple other really great books. And he battled with depression his entire life. And suicidal impulses and everything. Again, this is just his description. The pain grew and grew, and I began to experience suicidal thoughts. I realized that life for me was at a desperate impasse. I thought of the garage as a place where I might sit in the car and inhale carbon monoxide. I'd look at the rafters in the attic and think of them as places where I might hang myself. I looked at sharp objects as being implements for my wrist, right? Where people just, again, this incredibly accomplished person who would just drop into these periods of desperate depression where objectively the rest of his life was really going well, right? But he just couldn't pull himself out of the darkness. So if you ever want a really eloquent description of depression, that's a wonderful book. Again, depression, just some facts, common cold of mental illness. It's what the DSM refers to as a mood disorder. Again, this is disruption of feeling states, right? Again, there's this continuum with normality that virtually everybody gets depressed at some point or another. Life sometimes turns out some crappy stuff. things happen to you, you feel bad, and it feels, you feel hopeless. And for most people, that lasts for a little while, and they pull themselves out of it, or other events pull themselves out of it. But for other people, this doesn't happen. The prevalence of what's called major depression, which we'll talk about, define more carefully in a minute, is about 13% for men, 20% for women. So it's very common, again, even in its clinical form. It's the number 4 category of disability among those age 5 and up from the World Health Organization. Costs the United States about $83 billion a year to treat people with depression. So it's serious. So if this is a physical illness, right, we'd be going, wow, this is something we really have to deal with. It's causing, lots of people to, miss their jobs, require treatment. It's a drag on the economy. Again, not restricted to any age group, but common among adolescents and adults, right? So even children get depressed sometimes, but it's much more common starting with adolescence and moving in to adulthood. These are, again, these kind of criteria that the DSM, these are all things from DSM-4 actually, but they don't change a whole lot, and they have this, the important point is sort of the flavor. Again, you try and say, well, here's the checklist. What do you have to, how do you differentiate from just being the kind of depressed that's on the normal continuum, the way all of us get sometimes, right, from when it becomes diagnosable clinical disorder. And the idea is, the key is it's 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period, at least one of which is number 1 or number 2. So the 2 keys here are 1, depressed mood most of the time, nearly every day, can be irritable mood in children or adolescents. So there's this profound sadness, this feeling like I'm just sad, right? I feel bad. And then second, marked diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. So this kind of inactivity, apathy, I don't care, do you want to eat? No, I don't really want to eat. Do you want to drink? No, I don't want to eat. I don't want to drink. Do you want to do the thing, the activities that usually you like, your hobbies, sex, things like that? People don't want to do things, right? It's this combination of sadness, this depressed mood, and this inactivity, right? Not wanting to do anything or not caring about anything. And it can be associated with all these other sorts of things. It can cause people to sleep all the time or not be able to sleep at all. These feelings of worthlessness, inappropriate guilt, all these kinds of things that can manifest itself in all kinds of helplessness and hopelessness. And, but again, the keys are sadness and this apathy or inactivity. That's again for major depression. Major depression is also referred to as unipolar depression, right? Again, and that's the idea that it's characterized only by a negative mood. Somebody who's just depressed, called major depression or unipolar depression, to contrast it with the other version, which is often referred to as, or which is technically called bipolar depression, often referred to as manic depressive symptoms, where people oscillate between real deep lows and high highs, right? Where they go from depression to mania, where it's literally the opposite sort of thing. So, extreme happiness, extreme activity. So you go from sadness and apathy to extreme happiness and extreme activity, and sometimes very quickly. Usually over the course of weeks, right? Again, extreme happiness, energy, self-confidence, invincibility, loss of inhibitions, recklessness, grandiosity, drug abuse. Let me show you an example. Bipolar depression is really striking when it happens. It looks a lot like drug abuse, right? It looks like somebody who's high on amphetamines or something like that. And this is again another clip of and a little discussion of a woman who has bipolar disorder.
At the opposite end of the spectrum from being depressed. They are unusually cheerful, unusually optimistic. They can become euphoric. They can become so excited about the possibilities in themselves, in their world, that nothing seems impossible. And so they will be extremely talkative, physically active. It's sometimes impossible to interrupt a manic in a talk. They have what we will call a push of speech, meaning that they talk so rapidly that it is almost impossible, and sometimes impossible to interrupt. You may have to sort of really tap the patient several times, say, please stop for a minute, let me try to ask you something else, and they may not be able to stop.
What are your ambitions in life?
You mean my goals?
Yes.
I call them goals, you call them ambitions. See, we two different people. I know what you think. I can reach a man. I can reach a man right now. Want to reach a man?
Go ahead.
Y'all probably saying, oh, she anxious to be on TV, which I am. I'm happy because I'm on TV. I always wanted to be on TV on Channel 9. No, Channel 11, because I wake up in the morning, I take my daughter to school, I had this program, Speak Up America. And I said, oh man, I'm right there, I can do that.
What are your goals in life?
I want to be a surgeon, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a registered nurse, I want to be a psychiatrist. But my main goal, I want to be a psychiatrist, I can read minds real good.
At first look, you might think this patient was on speed or amphetamines because she seems so high and so hyper, but in fact, we know that she's not on drugs and did a drug screen. Her family also was concerned. They thought she might be taking some kind of drug, but she's really high on manic depressive illness, on the manic phase, almost as though there's a little tiny syringe of amphetamine that's going off in her brain all the time, putting her up, giving her this elevated mood. You feel like you have a lot of money in the bank.
I do. I just told you I got in there. $10,000.
Yeah.
I put it in there every month. I'm on welfare. But see, some people that get their welfare, they might go out and spend it. I don't do that. I cash my check. I get $225, $226 now every month. I live off of $26 a month. I put her $100 there, boom. Put me $100 over here, boom. And I add it together to $20,000. I don't know what to do with myself no more. That's why I can't remember. It's boring.
She thinks she has lots of money. She thinks she has $10,000 in the bank and so forth, but in fact her family's confirmed for us that she does not have that much money, that she's in fact rather poor. She believes she's going to go out and buy a beautiful white Buick Riviera with gold trim and a sunroof, but in fact she could never really afford such a thing. And these are things she really believes, and that's what we mean by grandiose delusions, because she couldn't be talked out of these ideas. How do you like the medications you're taking now?
I don't feel them.
They don't seem to affect you at this
At
point.
night, they do. Makes me sleepy, makes me drowsy. But in daytime, I got so much energy, I don't feel it. But what it does is this. It gradually slows while moving around down. It gradually slows my whole body down so I can go to sleep and I sleep just like that.
You feel like
Medication is beginning to mute this patient's third episode of mania.
So this is a good example. I mean, she almost looks, again, as if she's on drugs, and it starts to resemble, a little bit about the schizophrenic sort of disorganized too. She's just got to go so fast between everything, and she's so hyper, right, and can't stop herself. Obviously having kind of delusions of grandiosity. Again, in depression or in bipolar disorder, sometimes you'll get these kind of delusions where the thinking is so disordered from the mood that it kind of almost looks like a schizophrenic kind of pattern. Again, and depression, again, the story behind it is also very similar. That there seems to be, as research in the last 10 or so years has demonstrated, a substantial genetic component, about 30–40% concordance for monozygotic twins. And it's substantially and significantly higher for bipolar disorder. Right, so for major depression, for unipolar disorder, it's about 30–40%, it seems like, but for bipolar, there's a higher concordance rate, suggesting that bipolar disorder may have a different sort of genetic pathway and may, in fact, be more genetically determined, right? More of this idea that we're going to get to in a minute, this imbalance in neurochemicals, is the way you think. That's the manifestation of the genetic or biological disposition. And again, there's no genetic connection between depression and bipolar disorder, right? So they seem to be similar but different things, right? The neurochemical in this case, that's the major culprit is what's called serotonin. And what almost all the drugs that people take now, Zoloft, Prozac, are what are called SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Right, so they essentially, the serotonin that goes out into the system, they stop it from being brought back up into the cells of the brain. Right, so the idea is that somehow it's this serotonin imbalance that's causing the problem. And again, but again, it's much more, everything is in these cases is really complicated. So these drugs only help about 2/3 of the people. And they take weeks to affect, even though they affect neurochemicals right away. Right? So they affect things right away, but they don't have any effect overall. And there's other evidence, again, that maybe dopamine, norepinephrine, these other chemicals are also involved, right? So it seems to be some kind of neurochemical imbalance in the brain, but scientists honestly don't quite know all of it. Serotonin seems to be involved, right? And what it really is again, it's kind of and there was another paper, the guy that was right here a second ago was talking about, other research. I just saw a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago that's suggesting that everything's wrong about it, that it isn't, that they thought that, again, that too little serotonin out in the bloodstream, not in the cells, right, is sort of the problem. Now they're saying, well, maybe it's too much serotonin that's the problem, right? And so people have reinterpreted data. This is one of these cases where tackling these mental illnesses is challenging because we don't fully understand biochemistry, and there's also these sorts of environmental elements to it as well. And depression has clear environmental causes as well. There's no question that life events, right? So people very often get depressed and move into major depression after some terrible things happen to them. There's cultural and regional differences, right? So depression manifests itself differently in different cultures. Sometimes it shows up more as anxiety, sometimes it shows up more as depression, right? And the levels differ across cultures, and partly it may be a matter of just the other complication there, right, is maybe a matter of how stigmatized it is in different cultures and whether people are willing to come forward. So all the statistics are based on who comes forward and talks about it, right? And so we don't know, but it looks like there's cultural regional differences. Again, people who are low SES, people who are underemployed or unemployed tend to have higher rates of depression. Again, these are major losses, not having the things that you want. These environmental things seem to play a role as well. And gender's related. So 21%, 21% of women, 13% of men experience major depression. So there's always been some sense of, well, maybe women are, genetically or hormonally predisposed to depression, or maybe it is that women are just more willing to tell people, I'm sad, I feel crummy, where guys say, no, I don't, or let's go have drinks, or, so it becomes some other thing like alcoholism or some other kind of disorder, because it may just be these social roles that determine it, right? And that's important, right? If we want to know, is this genetic, is it tied into biological things? Right, that's one kind of explanation, and but you have to uncover, you have to dig underneath everything to find out, well, gee, is it really that women experience those sort of biological things at a higher rate than men, or is it just about reporting and the way it manifests itself and the way culturally we're allowed to talk about things, right? But clearly environmental precipitors to depression as well. And that's led to some really interesting kinds of theories. Another sort of issue within depression that makes it particularly complicated is the relationship between mood and thinking, and which comes first, and what role does the kind of negative thinking have in the development of the disorder. So this idea goes all the way back to a guy named Beck, who talked about what he used this. He was the major proponent of the idea that what the problem with depression is it's a negative way of thinking. They're essentially overly pessimistic, tend to see things in a really negative way, and then that makes you feel bad. When you see the world in a bad way, it makes you feel bad. He referred to it as stinking thinking, right? So you have this negative cognitive tendency, right? This negative style that can lead you to depression. We talked about that before last time, or when we were talking about the idea about the way people make attributions to things, whether they may show this positive attributional style or this negative attributional style, and all that work's kind of been wrapped up in this. Some of it goes back to another sort of idea about that's related to depression. Is this an idea of learned helplessness. How many people know about learned helplessness? This was work that was done originally with animals by a psychologist named Marty Seligman. And it was this really interesting idea that if you could train a dog to behave kind of in a depressed, apathetic way. So they would put dogs in this kind of a shock chamber, right? And then if you do this with the dogs, if you show them a light, and then 5 seconds later you turn on the shock, right? The dog goes, ah! And then jumps over to the other side. But you do that a couple times, the dog learns light means the shock's going to come on, so it jumps over, right? So it avoids it. But if you put a dog in this kind of situation where you show that light, it jumps to the other side's also shocking them. Right? You show them that if you show them for a while that their responses don't matter, right? They learn that their responses don't matter. So even when you make it work again, you show them a light, and if they jump to the other side, it would go off. They stop trying, right? They realize the light goes on. I'm not going to do anything different. Forget it. Right? They just stay on that side. They learn to be helpless. They act like they're depressed, and they'll just lay there and take the shock. So Marty Seligman saw that as an analog to what happens in depression, that people learn that somehow their responses don't matter, and then they become, they tend to develop this kind of negative cognitive style. In his case, again, making internal, global, stable attributions for bad things that happen. When bad things happen to me, it's all about me. I'm terrible at everything. I'm never going to change, right? And that it turns into this kind of a human version of learned helplessness. Now, the issue with all of this is it cause, is it effect, or is it both? Is it some sort of neurochemical imbalance that leads you to start thinking like this, right? Or is it thinking like this that makes you depressed, creates the chemical imbalance, perhaps, right? And that's always been the problem. Is it this some sort of a vicious cycle, right? That somehow having this neurochemical imbalance, which may make you sort of feel kind of sad, tends to lead you to think in this particular way, and then that makes you more sad and makes you think more in that way, and it just kind of feeds on each other, right? And those are interesting and important questions to ask. To what extent? Because if it's thinking that's the primary cause, then you try to fix the thinking. But if it's the chemical that's the primary cause, then you try to fix the chemical, right? If it's both, then you have to deal with both, right? And so this whole idea about kind of this vicious cycle is really common in depression. A lot of research seems to suggest that there's this kind of a cyclical quality to it. A really interesting version of this that's been applied is a social psychologist named Roy Baumeister, who's applied the similar kinds of ideas to the notion of suicide. Try to explain, how do you explain suicide in some psychological way? And what he picks up on is this idea that a lot of research has shown is that there's this kind of cyclical sort of nature that that what happens in depression very often is, again, you get, for whatever reason, you get into this cycle of negative thinking, negative mood, produce negative thinking, negative mood. And what that tends to have a particular quality to it. It's very often kicked off by some negative event, right? And then what it leads to is this sort of ruminating self-focus, right? Where that depressed people sort of get into this rumination cycle where they're going, my life really sucks, I just can't do anything, and well, should you fix it? Well, that's not going to work, and so I'm just going to sit here and think about terrible things, So there's this sense in which it just sort of feeds on itself, and they ruminate. And what he's arguing is that's a really aversive state, to be sort of self-focused on yourself. Right, focused on yourself when you're feeling bad and about all your bad qualities, right? And people will do almost anything to get out of that state. Again, some people will do things like drink, or when they're in a bad mood, they'll go out and they'll do something productive, go and try to break the cycle. I just can't sit here and wallow in my own suffering for a while. I'm going to go do something else, right? But other people just can't break out of that, right? And he says that unfortunately, one way to break out of that, or one manifestation of this, is this idea that you want to just escape self-focus, and one way to escape self-focus is to commit suicide, right? Because that stops you from thinking about yourself. And what he suggests is that what happens is that this, in a way of trying to escape from yourself, it puts you into the state of what he calls cognitive deconstruction, right? Where you're in this sort of ruminative focus, and it's kind of a description of the rumination as well. You tend to have this low-level, concrete thinking, a short and tight. You're in the here and now. You're stuck where you're in the here and now, and you're thinking in this kind of concrete way, and you don't feel the kind of emotion that you would normally feel, right? And that actually facilitates suicide, because the idea is that you're not thinking. Right now you're just going, I'm just here, I'm thinking about all the terrible things that can happen to me. Well, if I kill myself, then it'll all stop. But what you forget is, well, then you don't have the rest of your life. You have this short and time focus. And there's this, and again, he thinks that leads to this increased risk of suicide. And he has some really interesting evidence that he talks about, right? So some of it, for example, is that you would think, if you look at suicide notes that people leave, there's been a lot of research looking at, kind of gathering up and looking at suicide notes. You would think that they might be these big, grandiose kind of things, to people making statements about their life, and what you find is that very often they're very concrete. There are things like, make sure to pay the bills. The water bill's due next Thursday. You need to do that. And I want you to make sure that the dog gets fed. His food is up in the cupboard on the left. And it's as if they're in this kind of deconstructed state where it's so aversive for them to think about themselves. And that's all they're doing, right? And this shortened time focus, you see that state is very often what precipitates suicide. That's his theory anyway. And it's kind of interesting. Again, it's a way of just sort of avoiding that self-focus and this kind of vicious cycle thinking. Actually, one way that manifests itself, what people try to get out of it, is this idea of taking the ultimate step. Just to drive home finally this diathesis-Stress point. So again, that's what all this, just like schizophrenia, you see this pattern where there really seems to be some biological, genetic determinant, plus there's environmental stuff going on. Here's a nice study that demonstrates this really well by Ashlom Caspi and his group, where again it really consists with this diathesis-Stress idea. And the general notion is that there's a particular 5-HTT genotype, where we won't get into it too much, but there's essentially you can have either a long allele or a short allele on either one of your two genes. And if you have the long, that's kind of the normal one. And having a short allele on either of them, either the short-long or the short pattern, seems to be one of the genetic precursors of depression, right? So that runs in, it's genetically determined, and that seems to be associated with depression. But if you look and and look at different kinds of environmental factors, like whether the child was maltreated or not. So I do a big study. You've got some kids who were maltreated, severe maltreatment. Some probably were maltreated, and some with no, or were definitely not maltreated. And then you can look to see whether they have these alleles or not. right? And you see that what matters, and this is on the y-axis, is probability of the major depressive episode. So what's the probability that this person is going to have experienced a major depressive episode in their life? And what you see is, again, just having the vulnerability, right? So even if you've got the short allele, the big vulnerability, right? If you don't have maltreatment, you tend not to be depressed. Similarly, if you're severely maltreated, right? If you're stressed, but there's no vulnerability, there's no diathesis, no disorder, right? Where you get the disorder is up there. When you get both the vulnerability, they have that particular vulnerability to depression, and they experience this terrible event like child maltreatment, that's when you get to depression, right? So again, really consistent with this idea of what a lot of mental disorders have, this biological disposition. Come on guys, 1 second. About 15 words left maybe. Now I'm stretching it out, just on purpose, no. So you get the point, right? This is the Diathesis-Stress model, that it's this that there's most psychological disorders don't seem to have a purely biological cause. It's a combination of biology and environment. We'll see you guys on Thursday. Go see your exam if you need to. Take care.